I'm Josh Guetzkow. I am on the faculty at the Hebrew University in the School of Social Sciences and the Faculty of Law. I have a PhD in sociology from Princeton University, and I did a postdoc at Harvard in public health policy. Um, so all of that background helped me coming to the COVID period and the COVID era and trying to understand the public health implications of COVID measures um, and the COVID vaccines.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. I mean, you've done some really brilliant work. I mean, we obviously spoke. When was it the last time we spoke and you were talking about process one versus process two
Right.
with the
That
Pfizer
was
vaccine?
I remember that because I had just started working on the project we're going to talk about today, and that was 20 months or so ago. I think it was 2023. Yeah,
Yeah. Wow.
2023,
Yes, almost
fall
2 years
of
ago.
2023.
Yeah, yeah. And you've uncovered some amazing, I mean, some really damning discoveries. And I'm really interested in talking to you about your recent paper, which is really truly groundbreaking. Would you like to just talk a bit about your paper? First of all, how long did it take for you to do all your research to
Right.
get it to where it
Well,
is now?
it's sort of funny because it took us about maybe 6 months to get to the basic findings that we had. And then we spent the rest of the time checking it and testing it and adding more things and getting feedback on it and trying, it basically, when you do science, you try to disprove your hypotheses. You had to try to disprove so if you have a statistical finding, it's definitely possible that it's a fluke, it's because of something else that you didn't think of or whatever. So you have to test it and pull it and you push it and try to break it, tear it apart. And what we found, no matter what we did, we could not make this go away.
Yeah.
And it's been difficult because I haven't been able to tell people about it because we kept it, until we were ready to sort of go public with it. I've been biting my teeth because I think it's such an important finding. It's been hard to sit on it, actually.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so essentially what you have found, this is to do with the fetal loss. So this is you are monitoring pregnancies, and obviously the data you have is it's the volume which makes your work so much more reliable because it's such a
Right,
huge cohort that you're looking at. If you could just
right.
tell us about your paper.
Right. So our data is so one of the other things that makes our data special in this space of people who are trying to bring evidence regarding the potential safety problems of the COVID vaccinations is lack of access to individual level health record data. And that's what we have here. We have data, the individual level, complete health records on people in one of Israel's largest health funds. This is sort of like a HMO system they have there, sort of, and so it's 2.6 million people in this fund, and we have access to all of the pregnancies of the women that were insured in that. So over the period that we looked at about over 220,000 pregnancies.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's really, really high quality data.
yeah. Was it easy to get access to that data to have that handed over to you, or did you have to really fight for it?
I wouldn't, for me, it was easy because when I was brought into the project, that had already been secured. So my co-author, Retzef Levy, had secured access to the data, and um, two of our collaborators on the project are people at Maccabi. It's called Maccabi Health Services, and they are the ones who worked with us and made access available. They were also co-authors on a paper that showed that um, uh, the immunity from infection was superior, at least equal, if not superior to vaccine efficacy. And then we have another co-author from Maccabi. He's the head of the OBGYN services at Maccabi Health. So he's a very senior OBGYN specialist who's also on the paper. So we
Mm.
have some real heavy hitters.
Yeah, yeah. Please, Josh, please go ahead and tell us what you found.
So essentially, there's a method of safety analysis in the study of vaccine safety and safety for other things as well. It's called observe to expected, where you look at the number of events, of adverse events that occurred in a particular period, say 3 weeks after vaccination, and then you compare, then you calculate what would be the expected number of those events happening to that population during that time period, and you compare. If you have a higher rate of observed adverse events in that period than you were expecting, that provides a safety signal. The
Yeah.
problem with that method is they don't do a very good job of correcting or adjusting for people's background characteristics. Usually they'll break it down by age and gender, but there's so many other things that might make people, for example, one of the known issues in vaccine safety studies is the problem of the healthy vaccinee effect, which essentially means that in general, not always, but in general, people who go out and get vaccinated are just healthier in general. And they also have a kind of, health conscious, health awareness, health seeking behavior.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to measure that, even if you have lots of information about people. And so one of the problems with the general way of doing this observe to expected is this problem of not being able to kind of adjust for all of these different things. And that's really what sets our study apart from other studies that have taken that approach, because we have individual level data. And so when we look at historical data so we're studying fetal loss, right? We're saying, what if a woman is pregnant, is she going to lose her pregnancy? What are the chances of her losing her pregnancy? And of course, that changes over the course of a pregnancy. So it's very important to take into account when you're talking about it. If you're talking about it week 8, gestational week 8 is very different than gestational week 24, right?
Yeah.
Because your risk of losing your pregnancy goes down significantly through the course of the pregnancy.
Yes.
So what sets our study apart is that we're able, when we look at historical data, we're able to build a model that predicts the probability, the chances of a woman losing her pregnancy based on her characteristics, based on the calendar timing of the pregnancy, and based on the gestational week of pregnancy. So we build this statistical model, and
Mm.
then we use the results from an earlier period, 2016 to 2018, and we use the results from that model, and we apply them to women in the COVID period. We say, okay, if a woman is at this age and she smokes and she has these comorbidities and this, and she's in week 10, then her chances, based on historical precedent, her chances of losing the fetus are whatever, 20%. Okay. So
Yeah.
then we can look at all of the women, calculate their odds of losing, the probability of losing and that gives us an expected baseline. So we can say these women in week 8, uh, 200 of two, there should be 200 pregnancy losses. And then we can compare to the amount of pregnancy losses they actually experienced. Okay. And then, so that's the observed to expected, observed to expected. And so what we see is that women vaccinated in the first trimester, and specifically we look at weeks 8 to 13, and I can explain why. Um, if they were vaccinated with a COVID vaccine, they have a significantly higher, there's a significantly higher number of fetal losses that were observed that actually happened compared to what were expected. And in particular, if we look at just the first dose, okay, most women who got the first dose also took the second dose. So it's kind of like saying the first 2 doses. Okay, so we look at the first dose, women vaccinated in the first trimester, um, we would have expected 9 fetal losses, and we see 9 fetal losses per 100 women, and we see 13 fetal losses. That means there's an additional almost four
Yeah.
fetal losses per 100 women who were vaccinated in those weeks. So
Wow.
it's a huge, I don't want to call it an effect. Okay, we have to be very clear that even with observational methods, it's very difficult to draw causal conclusions, but it's a very alarming safety signal that needs to be taken seriously.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. And what you
it-
found is, which I think is even more statistically significant, well, I guess this, more of an alarming safety signal, is that the fetal loss occurred later on in pregnancy.
right, that's right. That was one of the things that really surprised us, is that so we can look, once we calculate women's probabilities of losing their pregnancy, we can calculate that for every week of pregnancy, and we can compare in this week, from this week on, what were the chances, and what is expected, and what did we observe. And so we see that as the pregnancy goes on, there's still a large difference in the observed to expected. So at week 14, at week 20, more than half of the difference, this four
Yeah.
additional fetal losses, happen from week 20, and almost half of them happen from week 25. Week 20 is usually the marker of where a fetal loss moves from being categorized as a miscarriage to being categorized as a stillbirth. So we're talking about over half of this difference occurred in stillbirth. Right? These are stillbirths. Women are losing their pregnancies at stillbirth.
Yes.
And this corresponds to a lot of anecdotal information that we were hearing. You know, there was a nurse from Fresno who was a whistleblower, and they're talking about some horrific things that were happening in her hospital. There was a doctor in Vancouver who was put into a mental institution because he was telling about midwives who were coming to him reporting this spike in stillbirths.
Yeah.
So, and there was a study done in Germany, a very careful study looking at excess stillbirths and how they were timed to around the vaccination period, or in line with what you would expect, kind of like 6, 9 months on from vaccination. So
Yeah.
it's a lot of corroborating evidence,
Yes.
and it's quite shocking. And okay, you know what? Let me bring something up. We're not the first to have studied this question. Okay, there's been a lot of research on it, and nobody found a safety signal. Nobody found a problem. And one of the reasons we think why they didn't find it is because the studies make this assumption that miscarriages are completely different from stillbirths and must be studied separately. And so what they'll generally do is, if they're looking, first of all, there are very few studies on vaccination early in pregnancy, which is why we focus on it.
Yeah.
But also they'll stop. They'll say, okay, we're only going to look 6 weeks after vaccination, or 3 weeks, or we're only going to look at fetal losses up until week 20. And as our research shows, if you do that, you're going to lose like more than half of your signal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. There's another reason. And also, they tend to differentiate between induced fetal losses and spontaneous abortions and
Yeah.
stillbirths. So there are a variety of reasons why we don't make that distinction. And some people, some of the feedback we got was, well, maybe this is being driven by people women getting elective abortions. It was the COVID period. They were scared. They didn't want to have babies. I don't know. And so that's why we looked at this later period to see if there was a delay in the observed to expected. And indeed, that's what we find. Women vaccinated early in pregnancy, most of them lost their uh, fetus at a time when they weren't doing elective abortions. In Israel,
Yeah.
there are very few elective abortions from week 20, and after week 25, it basically doesn't happen. It just, because there's regulations and stuff like that, it doesn't happen. So we know that a lot of our signal isn't driven by elective abortions. Okay, one other reason why previous research probably hasn't found what we found is that the problem is, so it's, I talked earlier about the healthy vaccinee effect. That means that women who are getting women who are getting vaccinated are healthier on average, should have less chances of losing their fetus.
Yeah.
Now, so these other studies compare women vaccinated during the COVID period to women who are unvaccinated during the COVID period. So if the unvaccinated women are less healthy, they're more likely to lose their fetus
Right.
compared to women who are healthier, right? And they're healthier, so they're less likely, and so it evens out, and then you don't find an effect.
It hides
Now,
the signal,
they
doesn't
they
it?
do they do try to control for comorbidities and stuff like that, but what we find is there's a dynamic kind of nature to this effect. So there's something transient, there's something sort of time dependent about this healthy vaccinee effect. And how do we know that? Because we also looked at women who were vaccinated for influenza
Right.
during the COVID period. We built the same model, and then we looked, does this And what we find is a stark contrast
Yes.
to the women who were vaccinated for COVID. We find instead of more fetal losses than expected, instead of the same number of fetal losses, we find less fetal losses than expected,
Yes.
which suggests that these women who are getting vaccinated for COVID, they should also have a healthy vaccine effect, actually, but they don't. They have the opposite. Okay,
Yeah.
and now here I want to show you a graph that kind of shows the contrast between the women vaccinated for COVID and the women vaccinated for influenza during the period. Um, oh, the sharing isn't turned on.
Oh, hang
Could
on.
you allow me
Yeah.
to
Great.
share?
Uh, is it?
Great. Okay. So what this shows is so here we have the COVID dose one vaccinations on the left and the influenza vaccinations on the right. Okay, the solid line is the observed, the number that actually occurred, and the dashed line is what's expected from our model. And so what you can see in these early weeks of vaccination, by the way, we're not looking before week 8 because there's all kinds of biases that can be introduced because women uh, may report a different, like more or less likely to report a pregnancy or a miscarriage to their doctor, and that could be confounded with other things. So we play it safe. Actually, we
Mm.
start at week 8, and we look, and you can see here there's like this. In these early weeks, the gap between observed and expected is more than 4. It's quite a bit more than 4. But if you average across weeks
Right.
8 through 13, the whole first trimester, that we look at, you get this number 4. But in earlier weeks, it's even higher, right? So you have this, and then it drops down, and you can see it's actually a little bit lower than expected. And we think that that's essentially a sign of the healthy vaccine effect. It's not really a protective effect, and I can talk about that once we look at the flu results. So here's influenza, and you can see it's flipped, right? You can see that throughout the entire period here, the number of fetal losses occurring among women vaccinated for influenza just drops. These weeks, it basically indicates if a woman was vaccinated in that week, right? The women who were vaccinated in that week, what is the observed to expected of eventual fetal losses? It doesn't mean they lost their fetus in that week. It means they eventually lose their fetus, okay? They lose the pregnancy. And so this is sort of women who are vaccinated in week 8, week 9, week 10, week 11. So we see here for influenza, it's exactly the opposite. The observed number of fetal losses is much lower than expected. It's about 5 fewer fetal losses. Okay? Now, if we were to use, so that means if we were to use in the weeks 8 to 13, if we were to use the influenza women as our baseline, because again, healthy vaccine effect, presumably the COVID vaccinated women should be similar,
Yeah.
then we're looking not at 4 additional fetal losses in the first trimester vaccinations, but 9 more.
Yeah.
9 per 100, that's 10, that's almost 10%.
Ah,
It's a huge, or 10 percentage point. It's a huge um,
wow.
difference, right? A huge, and then notice that the women are there. So people all throughout pregnancy, these women have a lower than expected. Okay? By the way, when we run our model on all women, when we run our model on unvaccinated women, and when we run our model on women vaccinated prior to pregnancy, our model does a very good job uh, of predicting the observed rate of fetal loss. It's only when we look at women who are vaccinating sometime during pregnancy that we see these differences, okay? They're stark differences. So now the observed rate is quite a bit lower than the expected rate. And the reason that we don't think the reason we think this is healthy vaccine effect and not a protective effect of influenza vaccination is that we did the same thing on influenza vaccination for the 2018-2019 period. We call it our validation period. We're validating our method by comparing to a different time. So people say, oh, the COVID period was so different and there was so much going on. How could you make this comparison? And we find essentially the same results for influenza vaccination from the earlier non-COVID period. Okay, so we have a graph that looks almost exactly the same as this. And so remember that during COVID, there was no influenza, right? It just disappeared. during these years, especially I think the first, I don't remember if it was the first year here or the second year. The results are the same, but essentially it means that the results are the same in 2018, 2019 when there was a really bad flu year
Yeah,
to years where there was no flu and you see the same results. So it can't be a protective effect because there was no flu to protect from, right?
yeah,
And you get the same result. So it's a healthy vaccine effect. So if the COVID vaccinated women are similar to the influenza vaccinated women, and we look at that in our paper, we look at the overlaps and such. Um, Again, if they're different in ways that we can't measure, because we measure differences and take those into account and adjust and everything, if they're different, if COVID vaccinated and influenza vaccinated women are similar, then the difference, this increase in the observed number of fetal losses over expected, this observed increase is even should actually be even higher.
yeah. Do you have a graph where you have the observed line for the COVID vaccination and the observed line for the influenza
I
vaccination?
don't. I
Yeah.
haven't made that graph.
Yeah.
I probably
I would
should.
like to show
Um,
because then you will really see the
yeah,
difference. Yeah,
people could really see the difference. Well,
yeah. But you can
I
obviously,
don't have that. I know that there was there's a somebody on X named Jicky Leaks. He did a graph like that, so you can
yes, yes,
somebody people can find that.
yes.
Yeah, I didn't. No, I don't have that.
Just to clarify, I mean, you really show a very clear-cut safety signal going on. It's just it's really ringing loud and clear. Um,
Right.
and obviously, as we know, I mean, I when I was digging through the whole Pfizer data dump back in April 2023, I was actually the first journalist to find the Pfizer's pregnancy and lactation cumulative review. It was
I
an
remember that. Yeah.
report, and I was, yeah, and then other people were reporting on it, but I was the first to literally discover it within the data dump, and it was so damning, so alarming. This is within Pfizer's own data. They're recording stillbirth, a spontaneous
Yes.
abortion, and
Hmm.
that report was compiled or signed off, I think, April 2021, when Pfizer signed
Right.
off that it submitted it to the FDA, and
Right.
literally the following, within like week or so, pregnant women were then encouraged to take the COVID vaccine. And
Right.
it's just really, I mean, I would say your paper is probably the first, would you say, that is really solid with it's so reliable. The data is so
Yeah, I
reliable
think so. Yeah,
and it
I think
counts
so.
for the bias, what you were saying, the health
Right.
vaccine bias.
Yes.
And it's such a large number, the volume. It's not, it's so statistically significant as
Yes. Yes. Our findings are very
and
statistically significant.
I mean, have you received any sort of pushback, any backlash for doing this? I'm just curious. I mean, right now it's a preprint.
It's
Are
a
you
preprint. Yeah.
okay? Are you looking to get it peer reviewed?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's currently been submitted to a journal and we're waiting to hear back. We've had some rejections, mainly based on, "Oh, this isn't important enough or something like that." We did have
Not
one.
sorry, saying that it's not important enough.
Yeah, well, we did have one serious review, and we responded, I think, quite more than adequately to all the reviewers' comments. And then they came, then they, but meanwhile, the journal changed editorship, and the new editor came back afterwards and said not significant, and something along those lines.
Oh,
Not not important.
yeah.
Not with I don't know some absurd. They can always come up with a reason.
Yes.
We know that's par for the course and that's part of the game, and we're
Yes.
going to get this published. I mean, the data is too good. The
Yes.
people on the paper are extremely distinguished. The analysis is very solid.
Yes.
And the main pushback that we've gotten is on X. Some people, chipping away, trying to show this and that, and maybe that, and maybe that. And for the most part, we have very good, in my opinion, responses to those. And people say, well, maybe there's something about the women getting vaccinated for COVID, that they're unhealthy. Okay, but then why is it only in those first few weeks that they're unhealthy and then suddenly they're healthy? Because we see this switch from
Yes.
more observed to expected and less
Just,
after. So from week 14, we're not finding the same safety signal again,
yes.
healthy vaccine effect, but
Yes.
um,
And
but
I want
but they can't. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just was this is primarily the shots. Was it primarily the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine that these
It's almost
pregnant?
entirely Pfizer. So this is Israel, right? And Israel was the first. They secured large quantities of vaccine from Pfizer, and in exchange for essentially serving up the country as a petri dish, as a lab experiment. And I'm not exaggerating. That's what the prime minister said. It's what Albert Bourla said. It's what the FDA committee said when they met with the Israelis. Um, women were encouraged were the vaccine was recommended for pregnant women in the second and third trimester. So they started vaccinating mid-December. By mid-January, they started recommending it for women in their second and third trimesters. And the only reason they didn't, and this is on record, the only reason they didn't recommend it for women in their first trimester is because there is so much miscarriage in the first trimester. They didn't want women to erroneously connect the two and give the vaccine a bad name. Okay, and that's very, very cynical. Okay, but it only took them 2 weeks to get over that reservation because by February 1st, they were recommending it for all women in all stages of
So this is
pregnancy.
February 1st, 2021.
Yes,
They were
yes,
okay. I mean, have you? I'm sure you are aware of the sort of bias, the Lipkind et al. Study. Lipkind. Have you heard about that study that was done earlier on? That was a they it was 10,000 women. This was done in America, and they came out with a conclusion. Oh, it's so safe because 1.7% of the women received the shot in their first trimester. So it was heavily skewed. So the
right.
like a tiny fraction received it in the first trimester, the majority
Right.
received it in the second. So that sort of hid the signal that was going.
Yes, it did hide the signal. And we talk about that on our paper that in our case, there were relatively few women that were vaccinated in that period.
Yes.
And so, and because the fetal losses are spread out throughout the pregnancy, it kind of smooths any signal that you might see. And so yeah, it was very
Did you
well concealed, well hidden.
did you see any signals going off with any birth defects, any anomalies like
Right.
that?
So we didn't check that, and there are a few reasons. One is it was sort of like it's an additional thing to then connect the women to the children's health records and try to figure out birth defects because that's not on the woman's health record. And then in terms of fetal defects and things like that, that's also it's written in the clinician notes, but it's not kind of in the data itself. So we would have had to go through all of the notes from all of the pregnancy to try to find that. So it was too onerous a task.
My
Yeah,
my other question to you is, did you see any batch specific signals going
right,
with the
right.
batches? And I
Well,
wanted
that's
to know
definitely
about the
something that
process
we,
one versus
right.
process two.
Yeah, process one, process two, and on top of that, the batch variability. I mean, everybody in Israel got batch process two, right? Everybody basically in the world got process two.
Yeah.
We have not yet obtained the batch information, the lot numbers. We hope we'll be able to do that in the future in general, but currently we don't have that data. They should exist and we should be able to connect them, but we're not. The only thing we have right now is who's the manufacturer, and virtually everybody, 97+% of women in the study received the Pfizer vaccine.
I'm sure you're aware of the non-clinical studies that Pfizer did on the rats, and that showed a
Yes.
big increase in the implantation loss going
Yes,
on.
implantation loss. So like the
Yes,
woman,
I remember writing
yes,
about that a
right.
few years ago.
Yeah, yeah,
That
absolutely. And
was
then
it showed up in the animal studies.
it showed up in the animal studies. And by the way, those animal studies were only done on process one. They never did, as far as we know, animal studies on process two. So it could have been even worse. How did they hide that? They pulled some rabbit out of their hat and instead of comparing the rats in the study, they compared them to other rats. Anyway, there was something I wanted to say now. Shoot, and now I forgot. Okay, well, that's all right.
No, no, I'm sure you'll think of it. I
Yeah.
I wanted to ask with your just so I really understand your expected data, and that's drawing on all women. What is that?
Right.
Yeah,
So
what,
we build a statistical model. It's a
yeah,
regression model based on women from 2 years, 2016 to
I see.
2018.
I see, I see.
So, based on this woman's characteristics and the week of gestation and the calendar month of conception,
Yes,
what are her chances of losing the fetus from this point forward in the pregnancy?
yes, yes, yes.
And then
Uh,
we use those estimates to adjust. It's a kind of there's a lot of statistical details that I probably don't want to go into, bore your
yes,
readers to death, but
yes.
that's the basic
Did you
idea. And the
notice?
paper's up on, the paper. Hopefully, when you share this, you'll have a link to the paper. People can
Yes,
look at that. It's
yeah.
I think it's pretty straightforward. It's not.
And you said it was more, is it was more after dose one that you saw that sort of
Well,
high,
okay, so we looked at dose. Yes, we looked at dose one, dose two, dose three. Dose one and dose two are very similar because most women who got dose
dose
one
3 weeks.
also got dose two.
Yeah,
So went on to get dose two just 3 weeks later, and so we kind of ignore. We have the results in the supplement, but we don't want to confuse people. Basically, if you got the first series of doses, that's the result.
yeah.
If but for dose three, it was lower, so it was instead of four, about four additional per 100 pregnancies. For dose three, it was about two additional. And now here's the interesting thing about this is that most of the women who got dose one got dose two. So they're getting two doses in pregnancy. The women who got dose three only got dose three. They didn't get a second dose. And so we see a higher number when women got two doses and a lower number when they got one dose, which suggests the possibility of a dose response relationship here, right? That
Just to clarify, the women that got dose three, you're saying they only got one dose?
during pregnancy.
I
They
see.
only got one dose during pregnancy. They got the two doses prior to pregnancy. They
I
get pregnant,
see.
and then so it's not overall, right? Because we don't find a safety signal for vaccination prior to pregnancy. Only during pregnancy, during early pregnancy.
Wow. Yeah. So there is a dose specific signal going off.
There is a dose specific signal. Yes,
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 yes.
yeah,
And obviously, I mean, what I found very alarming is the later they lost the fetus later on at a later stage, which goes
right,
against the whole natural, what
right.
you would mix, yeah, what you would expect. It's like you don't tend to lose it later on. It's always usually in the
It's
first trimester,
very rare.
not in the
Yes,
second and
yes,
third.
yes, yes. It's
Um,
very rare.
yeah. I mean, you've done such important work, and obviously, I know you work with also Retsef Levi, who's now gone on to be a new member for ACIP for advising the CDC. I mean, what do you hope to accomplish, Josh, from your paper? What would you like to see happening?
What I would love to see happening is an advisory from public health organizations, public health authorities advising women against COVID vaccination in pregnancy, or at the very least in early pregnancy. Um, and I would also like to see more research on this and a better attempt to come to terms with the limitations of existing research,
Yeah.
prior research.
Yeah. Are you going to look at any sort of mechanism of action, any sort of causal, what's going on? Why are these fetuses
Right.
being lost? In
So
a,
we don't have the expertise to do that,
okay.
but I would love to see more research done on that. There is some research that's been done on that. There was a recent paper where they found, trying to remember exactly what they found. There's some kind of insufficient. Oh, I know. Okay, this was actually somewhat different. This was rats injected that had problem with ovarian insufficiency, and that's somewhat different than ours. But we have a paragraph in our paper where we refer to studies that point to potential mechanisms for this.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. That's also very important. If this is happening, why is it happening? And because it's so delayed, that sort of adds a whole nother twist that it could be happening through various mechanisms, right? And earlier pregnancies may have one mechanism, later pregnancies may be through a different mechanism. It's
Do
hard
you
to say.
say there could be to do with accumulation, a buildup? So you obviously know that lipid nanoparticles travel all the way. They go through the placenta because going back
Right,
to that Pfizer report that I found, that 8-page report,
right.
um, it talks about the placental route, and
Right. Absolutely. Yeah,
obviously
it
they've
could.
lied and
Yes.
told women, oh, it just stays in your arm. It doesn't, I mean, we know, I mean,
Right.
insane
And
lie.
they knew. They knew when they told us that. They
And it
knew.
was
They
every,
knew because Pfizer showed them. They knew because of research for years that had been showing lipid nanoparticles go
and
to
the
ovaries and
biodistribution studies that were done
yep.
showed that. Yeah,
They knew.
they
They
knew.
knew. Yeah.
So
There's
having a, yeah, I'm just sort of, is there an accumulation building up of these toxic particles going into the, and that is causing the demise of the fetus?
it
It's
could be, I don't know. I don't want to speculate. I'm also, it's not my area of expertise. But I do want to say before we finish up, because you did mention the Pfizer document. So in that document, people use that document and they say, there's an 82% miscarriage rate. And look at the Pfizer documents show us there's an 82% or 81%, whatever it is.
extrapolate
The
that.
problem with that statement, and we've tried to get people to correct it, but they just won't. And it frankly, it discredits us, right?
Yeah.
Because if there was an 82% miscarriage rate, nobody would. It's unmissable. It's unmissable. You can't hide it, right?
Right.
Um, so the problem is, it's not that it was 81% of the. There were a certain number of adverse events that were pregnancy related, and of those 80 whatever percent involved a miscarriage. They also involved other things, but that doesn't mean that the rate of miscarriage for vaccination is 82%. It's just
So they
it's
got
just
they
the
got the,
adverse events that were reported for pregnancy.
yes,
Okay, but what? So there's no denominator that you
they've
can
got the
reliably come
denominator
and say
wrong. Yes.
81%.
Yeah.
And there's another paper out there. People talk about this CDC paper, Shimabukuro, 86%, and that's again another misreading. And but I mean, I understand how they misread it because it's a horribly written and confusing paper, but they're using the wrong denominator. Because the paper was published at a time when not all of the women had completed their pregnancy, and so they didn't include them in the denominator. And when you don't do that, you get a much higher rate. But that you
Absolutely.
can't do that, and it's wrong to say that,
Yes.
and it's just wrong, and it just completely discredits us, and it drives me crazy. So
Yes.
please don't do that.
Yes.
Not you, your listeners.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but yeah.
Yeah, no, there is, and it's yeah, the denominator was wrong, and that's they, yeah, you can't extrapolate that out from. No, it's important that you made a point about that. That's very important. Is there anything else, Josh, you'd like to say before we end the interview?
Okay, I will say one thing. There's a lot of conspiracies theories out there that the Jews are behind this COVID vaccines, and the vaccines that were given out in Israel were placebos. And it's just, I hope that this study, if nothing else, will show that no, these women were not getting placebos here. Okay, anything but. Um, and uh, the people in Israel were the first to really bear the brunt of the adverse events from COVID vaccines, and they were also the first to try to raise awareness of it. And I think the first documentary that came out that looked at COVID vaccine injury was from an Israeli woman who put her life aside to document this and bring it to the world's attention. I think it's called the Testimonies Project. I don't remember. I'm going to send you the link, and hopefully you can put it
I'll put it,
in your
absolutely.
blog
Please
post
send
and
me
your
the
show
link. I'll
notes.
put it in. Yeah.
Very important for people to look at that. It's with English subtitles. Yeah. So that conspiracy theory is just
And also the myocarditis signal that was going on.
right.
It was within the Israeli population. That was
Very early,
Israel.
January 2021, they alerted the CDC,
Yeah.
and the CDC essentially told them, we don't see it in ours. But as you know, and as I showed with the CDC wasn't doing a safety signal analysis. They weren't doing it until the following year, 16 months after the rollout. So how could they say, well, we don't see it because they didn't see it because they weren't looking for it.
Yeah. And to do the safety signal analysis, is it always observed versus expected? You do it.
No, that's one way. That's one way. And they have a presentation. The CDC has a presentation using that for myocarditis in late August that they
Yeah.
presented. The main way to do it with an adverse event, okay, there are different ways. That's one way, but usually it's called the proportional reporting ratio, where you compare the rates of different adverse events reported for one vaccine to the rate reported of that adverse event reported for existing vaccines to see if there's a difference.
I
And
see.
of course, when they finally did it 16 months later, they found over 700 safety signals, 500 of which were stronger than the signal for myocarditis. And they never reported that to the public. They kept it hidden. It was only released through a Freedom of Information Act request. So,
This,
yeah, it
yeah.
just, they failed. You know, we were
Yeah.
just completely failed by the public health authorities.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it takes sort of, scientists like yourself, researchers like yourself to share with the public what's really been going on. So I really commend you, Josh, your efforts and your team for doing that. And thank you so much for talking with me today about
Thank
your
you, Sonia.
important paper. Thank you.